the reality is that when our three fundamental human needs, which we talked about in one of our previous self-determination theory episodes, when those three needs are getting met, our motivation goes up. And when those three things are going unmet, our motivation goes down, or our ability to motivate goes down. Our capacity for motivation. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. When our needs are met, our capacity for motivation is high. And when they're going unmet, their capacity is low. And like you said, when our capacity is low, we start to not do well in our lives, and then we feel worse, and it creates the vicious cycle. And the good news about vicious cycles is that when they get reversed, they turn into virtuous cycles, because you start to get the needs met, you're feeling better, you're starting to get more motivated, and all of a sudden you're seeing yourself being more successful, and that success feels good, and then it leads to more motivation, which leads to more success, and that creates the opposite. So it's really, really dramatic when that goes from a vicious cycle to a virtuous one. It when it gets turned around, it's obvious.
Yeah.
And really awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome to see. For most of human history, people have parented the way their parents and grandparents did, with culture providing the cues. We call this Parenting 1.0.
For various reasons, parents began to question these approaches, and we started turning more and more to so-called experts to learn to parent. This was the beginning of Parenting 2.0. This allowed for some real advances, but also a lot of confusion as we got further and further away from our natural parenting instincts.
Parenting 3.0 is about reclaiming those instincts and integrating them with our current understanding of child development. It brings together the wisdom of the past with the best scientific and psychological research of the present.
Parenting 3.0 isn't a fad or a quick fix. It's a set of principles that allows us to engage with our kids and life from an informed and empowered place.
I'm Jai Flicker.
And I'm Deb Blum.
Welcome to Parenting 3.0.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be back talking about self-determination theory. Again, this is part 3, and we're going to talk today about motivation. And last week, we also talked about motivation. In that one, we talked a lot about really applying motivation to real life. We actually went through an example with me being coached by Jai. It was kind of just happened that way. And then we're going to talk today about the underlying framework of motivation, understanding motivation in a more theoretical way so that we can, I think it would just be helpful to be able to understand it so that we can apply it to our life in a more skillful way.
For sure.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I was just going to say, for me, what's been really cool about understanding this better is I realized that I had a lot of things that ways that I looked at motivation that were not only wrong, and we talked about that last time, but even just a misunderstanding about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and applying a layer of judgment on one being better than the other, or certain ways being better than the other, and it's helped me to feel a lot more spacious, maybe, around the terminology, so that I feel like I can hear it better and I can understand it better, and I think it directly applied to my my kids. Yeah. So I think I took the pressure off of myself on the idea that they need to be intrinsically motivated to do everything.
Yeah.
Or else it was bad.
Yeah. Well, I think this kind of, in keeping with parenting 1.0 and 2.0, I feel like parenting 1.0 often will, because it's sort of traditional, right? It's like there's the most obvious form of motivation is sort of punishment and reward. that's very extrinsic. And so I think, this concept of like intrinsic motivation is sort of a parenting 2.0 concept that can get taken to such extremes that then it's like creating all this stress for us of like, oh my gosh, we have to have perfectly intrinsically motivated kids. and so I think the parenting 3.0 integration point is understanding the science behind this. And part of what the science reveals, as you're alluding to, is that extrinsic motivation is not only okay, it's necessary, and in some ways it's more effective, and in some situations in particular it's more beneficial and more effective than intrinsic motivation, and we'll talk about that. That was really eye-opening for me as well. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But I think the fact that you before we talked about this continuum from self-determination theory, that you had a sense of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation is indicative of the fact that this information has started to permeate our culture.
Right.
For me, I first got exposed to it through a book called Drive by Daniel Pink. And he does a really good job of talking about this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And I went back and looked at that book, and it turns out it's like almost exclusively based on the researchers, DC and Ryan, who came up with self-determination theory. I mean, it's like, it's basically a translation of it. Into popular culture.
Right. Well, you have said that about a lot of things, right? That there have been a lot of things that you have seen where so once we understand self-determination theory, we begin to see that it's all over the place. I've seen people write articles where they don't necessarily use the same language, but they're still using the same three needs. And so I see that too. And didn't you say one of the ones that I just thought about was the Jessica...
Gift of failure?
Yeah, the gift of failure. Yep. And that's another one. I think it's just amazing to
completely
see.
It's like 100% based on that. The three needs. It was,
I didn't mean to digress. I just was thinking about
it's
how
all over the place.
We start to see it everywhere.
Yeah, it's really influential.
Yeah.
Where to begin? Oh my goodness. I think one of the things that comes to mind is just an idea that can help get us rolling here is, and this actually comes from Edward Deci, who is one of the co-founders of the theory. I was watching a presentation, a YouTube video of his own on self-determination theory, and when he talked about motivation, what he said was a lot of people, when they think about motivation, think of it as either something you have or you don't. It's like you're either really motivated, it's just a matter of degree, or somewhat motivated or not very motivated. And I think that does sort of capture a common view of motivation. But what they've done, which is so amazing, is they've identified several different types of motivation. So it's not just... and they've created this continuum of these different kinds of motivation. It's not just whether you're motivated or not. It's in what way are you being motivated. So like the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is maybe the first and simplest distinction to be made and to understand. But there are more gradations. And knowing these differences has been really helpful for me. I guess, like you said, it's helpful for me personally, and it's helpful for me in supporting and helping to motivate others. Yeah. So before I dive in, do you have any thoughts that you want to share?
I think that, I just think I'm actually excited. I've heard this from you before in bits and pieces, so I'm excited to hear you explain it in a more comprehensive way. And I feel like I'm always learning. Yeah, I think For me these days, a big piece of it is motivating myself. And so as we knew in the last, on the last episode, we talked about that. But I'm really curious about both motivating myself and motivating others. So I feel a lot of curiosity. Yes.
Good. Okay, perfect. So, okay, let's dive in. So we'll have to link to an image of this because it's helpful to look at.
That's a great idea.
But I'll describe it in as clear and simple a way as possible. So the continuum goes from on the one end, on the far left, it's amotivation, meaning not motivated at all, and then on the far right is intrinsic motivation, which is basically we're doing it because we want to. It feels fun or good, or we just have motivation. We just feel like doing it. It's not coming from outside of us at all. We're not feeling pressured. We're not feeling coerced. We're not feeling bribed. We're not feeling, pushed. We're just doing it. It's for the sheer joy of it. And so those are sort of the bookends. And then in the middle is this vast territory of extrinsic motivation, and we'll probably spend the most time talking about that because there are sort of these 4 different types of extrinsic motivation that they talk about. And but before going into that, I do want to just clarify a little bit these bookends. So from amotivation on the one side to intrinsic motivation on the other. And amotivation is basically, when you're basically so depressed that you just can't even get yourself out of bed. I mean, that would be maybe the most extreme version of it. Or you're just, maybe you're still forcing yourself to do something, but you are so against what you're doing that you're 100% against it, but you're still doing it. And you're just going through the motions, but hating it. Those would fall in that far. Like you're just so not being autonomous. You're not self-endorsed at all.
Right.
So that's the far side of that.
So do you believe, I have a few thoughts on this.
Yeah, please.
One is, so I feel like there are a decent number of teenagers who their parents might characterize them as amotivated.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's accurate?
Yeah. I mean, if they had the language, you mean?
Yeah, right. After learning this.
I think, yeah. Where I went was like, this is, and I think we did touch on this last time, is that a lot of times the word is lazy.
That's what my second question was going to be, is that what people say is when someone's like, oh, they're so lazy, they don't ever want to do anything, they don't get their homework done, they won't clean their room, whatever.
Yeah. Usually when you ask a kid who has been identified as lazy, and sometimes who self-identifies as lazy, right? They'll come in and they go, I don't know, I'm just so lazy. It's like, they're not proud of that. Obviously, it's like a negative connotation, but it's not just that they're like, that's a negative label, I don't like it. It's like, they don't want to be that way.
They don't want to be that way.
So you have to ask, if they're, like if somebody's like, I am so lazy and I love it, that's different. But I don't think I've ever heard a teen say that. They're just like, I just can't get myself to do the thing.
I know.
So this is this really important overarching, I think, misconception is that motivation is something that we have kind of almost, maybe not perfect control over, but like an 80% control over. It's not 100%, but it's like for the most part, we just, if we want to do something, we motivate ourselves to do it. And if we don't, we don't, and that's it. But it's just, it turns out it's not like that. So it's a lot more, we're the subject of our own motivation or lack thereof, not the master.
Yes. And it feels like I guess what I was, because my next question was going to be, is that a characterization about the laziness characterization? And I felt like I wanted to just pour in a little bit of compassion for people who feel this way, who, like kids as an example, like a child, but even for us as adults, like when we're in that place of amotivation, and we might be calling ourselves lazy or calling our kids lazy, or our kids are calling themselves lazy, that it isn't usually where we want to be. And that generally speaking, we don't know how to get out of it. And that I remember an article that I read that I really hope I can find. And I know I shared it with you, and I also shared it with the principal of our school. And I remember he pulled a quote out of it and kept it at the bottom of his email signature. And it was really the question. It said something like, there are no lazy students.
Yeah.
And that there's always something that's behind it.
Exactly.
And I just wanted to make a call out to trauma, and to like kids who aren't eating, they didn't get fed well in the morning, or kids who have had experiences that make it hard for them to study, or even kids with diagnoses, like someone who has ADHD or something. In those contexts, it's like there really is something that needs to be explored, that there's something deeper. Yeah, that is a reason why they're not doing what we wish they would do,
or they wish they would do,
or what
themselves.
They wish they would do.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And usually, it is self-fulfilling. Like I see one thing in the description, on the chart, and it talks about incompetence and lack of control. And I think it must be a very hard place. I mean, it's not that I've never experienced amotivation, but when I'm thinking about it in the context of teens, I just feel so much compassion for how hard it must be for them to feel they can't really control themselves they can't do what they want to be doing. And it's a self-fulfilling cycle of, then they feel incompetent, and the more incompetent they feel, the less they feel they can do.
Yeah.
And then it's just
a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle. So I just wanted to bring a little bit of care to that.
Yeah.
I know. And I can feel it for adults too, but there's a way that I can feel it for our teenagers, or I guess it really starts when they start having to have more homework, and when the expectations increase, which might start as early as elementary school for some kids, the pressure.
Yeah. It's so important. It's like, when I tell students that almost nobody understands motivation, I'm telling them that about them, but I'm also telling them about the people around them who might be trying to motivate them, but incorrectly, whether it's parents or teachers or coaches or whatever, because the kids are feeling like they're letting themselves down, but they're also feeling like they're letting down whoever's trying to motivate them. They're like, what is wrong with me? Right. And so that's where this sense of incompetence comes in, but it's also diminishing their sense of relatedness, right? They feel ashamed, so they're like not living up to the expectations. And as we'll get into, they're not feeling autonomous because they're trying to force themselves to just do whatever the thing is.
Yeah.
And so the reality is that when our three fundamental human needs, which we talked about in one of our previous self-determination theory episodes, when those three needs are getting met, our motivation goes up. And when those three things are going unmet, our motivation goes down, or our ability to motivate goes down. Our capacity for motivation. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. When our needs are met, our capacity for motivation is high. And when they're going unmet, their capacity is low. And like you said, when our capacity is low, we start to not do well in our lives, and then we feel worse, and it creates the vicious cycle. And the good news about vicious cycles is that when they get reversed, they turn into virtuous cycles. Because you start to get the needs met, you're feeling better, you're starting to get more motivated, and all of a sudden you're seeing yourself be more successful, and that success feels good, and then it leads to more motivation, which leads to more success, and that creates the opposite. So it's really, really dramatic when that goes from a vicious cycle to a virtuous one. It when it gets turned around, it's obvious.
Yeah.
And really awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome to see.
So I have one little bit. I know we want to move on to probably intrinsic motivation, but I do want to stay for one moment on this because it makes me think about episode 7, where we talked about triggers and why our children, what might be behind our children's behaviors. And we also talked about when our kids are being reactive or emotional, like something's going on, maybe they're having a tantrum. But in any way, we talked about even teens, like a teen being emotional, and how we often come in and we try to meet them in their thinking brain, right? And so if you want to understand that better, go back and listen to episode 7.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. But when that happens, what we end up is with a disconnect, because our child, our teenagers, in their emotional center of their brain, and we're trying to meet them with reason and thinking and trying to make sense of it, or somehow trying to fix them or make it better. And one of the thoughts that comes to my mind is this idea that when a child is when a child is amotivated, is in amotivation, and we're thinking they're lazy, and we have all these labels and these thoughts, and they're not feeling that great about themselves, that one of the great entry points is relatedness, right? Because we can't really make them feel more competent. They have to do that for themselves. We can create the conditions for that, but we can't really make them feel more competent. And often as parents, we're afraid to give them too much autonomy, because we're afraid they're going to just, like, if we say,
abuse
like,
it.
have at it, go ahead and just do what you want to do, that they're not going to do their homework, or they're not going to do the thing that we wanted them to do. And so that can be a difficult entry point. So the entry point can be in relatedness.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes me want to share an example of when, I have heard people many, many times do this, where a child says something like, "I'm so stupid."
Yeah.
And the parent, it's so painful to hear our kids say that. So we don't believe it. We see them, we see their potential, we see how bright they are, and we see how capable they are. And we're just like, why can't you see it? And so the way we handle it is, no, a person doesn't say "I'm so stupid" from the thinking part of their brain. They say "I'm so stupid" from the emotional part of their brain. They're feeling defeated, and they don't know what else to say. And it's actually in some ways a way of just being like, well, I can't do it. I mean, I don't know why I can't do it. I'm so stupid. I can't motivate myself. I can't do this, and it's this lack of competence. But what the challenge is for a parent to resist trying to remind them that they're not stupid. And that doesn't mean that we don't have to jump on board, right? We don't have to say like, you are pretty stupid. Like, that's probably not going to be very helpful, but I have known parents to say things like, "We don't say stupid in our house," or "I'm not going to let you be critical of yourself," or that "you are not stupid. You are one of the brightest kids I know." And the problem is that is actually super incongruent with what they're feeling in the moment. They may even know they're actually really bright. They might even know that, but in that moment they feel stupid. And that's the thing that's different, is the feeling versus the knowing, and if they're in their emotional center of their brain, the invitation and the part of relatedness would be to imagine, either physically, emotionally, all of the above, kind of like you're coming up beside them and you're just able to say something that meets them where they are. And it could be something like, "You're feeling really stupid right now. Like, I hear you. I hear that you're feeling that way right now." Or it might just be like, "Wow, like, this is hard. This is really hard." Or I just see you and I just want to be with you. Like, sometimes I've had times where I feel really stupid and I feel like I can't get something and I cannot motivate myself. And I really do know what that feels like. And so I'm just going to like hang with you.
Yeah.
And just kind of like, we're going to struggle through this together.
Yeah.
The one thing I want you to know is you're not alone. I'm with you, and I'm by your side, and we're going to figure this out. And we're not going to always have to figure it out by you having to do better and me push you harder. We're going to figure this one out by me just being on your team.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, you're intuitively kind of feeling into what was very eye-opening for me. Another gem that came out of the same theoretical framework around the basically when somebody, especially if it's we can think of ourselves or we can think of a teen. I'm thinking of teens when I am working with students and they are struggling to motivate. It turns out that there's really two main proximal causes, meaning like if somebody's just super depressed, like really, really depressed, then they're going to be globally amotivated to do anything, right? But if somebody's sort of in a more usual sort of mode and they're going along, but they're just really struggling to motivate on this particular assignment, for example, or this particular activity, there's usually two specific things to look at. And one is has to do with if the activity seems pointless or relevant.
Yeah.
Okay, and kids talk about this all the time. They go, what's the point of this, right? And so, right, it's hard. If you really get it, you go, God, this is going to be so useful. Well, there's the motivation right there. I mean, and then, and if you go, I'm going to spend all this time for what? For no good reason. It's just a waste of time. The motivation drains out. So this one makes, I think, tons of sense. And actually the second one does too. The other one has to do with, like you said, competence. So even if you have that first, what would I say, category met, if you're feeling like, yeah, this is important, it is worthwhile, but there is literally no possible way that I will be able to accomplish the necessary task, then you go back to, well, why bother?
Right.
Why even start?
Right.
What's the point? I can't do it. So those are really the two things. Does it matter? And can I do it? And I've used that framework so many times with kids. If they're not feeling motivated, I go, here, I'll tell them, I say, here are the two things. Are either or both of those in play here? And I've had 100% success rate in at least identifying the situation. It's always one or the other or both of them 100% of the time.
That's amazing that it is.
It is amazing that it's really, it's like, this is a thing. This is why I love this framework, is that it's like, that's pretty simple. And it confirms some very intuitive senses about, my own self and my own levels of motivation in different contexts. But until you kind of have a team of researchers go through and identify it and name it and go, these are the two things, it sort of just is ambiguous. It's kind of vague. It's kind of like, I don't know. Sometimes I feel motivated. Sometimes I don't.
I don't. I know. Yeah. And so when you ask that question, to me, that's bringing in relatedness. It's like what I had said was sort of just being like, hey, I'm with you. And that's super important.
Very related.
But there's also a relatedness to being even able to, like, say as a parent to a child, to be able to actually ask those questions, because then, and even the part where you said, like, listen, I just want you to know, like, it's actually not that uncommon, to be feeling this way. A lot of people don't understand motivation. Here are some of my thoughts on it. And if they feel like they're better understood by us, by asking the question. Now, do you actually explicitly ask the question? Like, here are the two things, and you say, like, is it
which one
relevant?
Is it?
Yeah,
or is it both? I think it, to use this, relatedness, autonomy, and competence framework, I think it also supports competence, because as soon as you start to get these distinctions for one's, like, as soon as a teen gets this distinction for him or herself, they're feeling already more and empowered
For sure.
to make sense of this thing that's just kind of haunting them and hanging over them and hampering them. The 3 H's. You know, the 3 H's.
The 3 H's.
God, the 3
oh my
H's.
God.
Yeah. But anyway, I think it does because then they go, well, yeah, no, they might go, well, it is kind of annoying, but I get why it's important. It's just like, I really don't think I am capable of doing it. And so then it totally focuses the conversation.
Yes.
Because then it's like, okay, well, let's talk about that. What's going on, and what and I start to think, well, what can I do to scaffold their experience so that they can do it in bite-sized pieces, so that they can, sometimes it's that they really do have a sort of an underdeveloped side, and so they're just coming up against the growth edge. And other times it's not that at all. They have plenty of capacity and they're just really intimidated. I mean, it's like you don't know until you get in there and kind of start having the open conversation. Yeah. So that's it can be really, really helpful. And the interesting thing is because when the needs are being met, the motivation level goes up. There's sort of a double positive. This is part of that virtuous circle that gets created, is like all of a sudden they're not just, they're both, we're helping diffuse the very specific hindrance, and their needs are getting met. And so there's more just sort of general motivational energy available to them. And so you kind of are reducing the barriers at the same time as you're increasing the capacity. And all of a sudden they're like taking the ankle weights off, and they're like, man, I feel like I'm running so fast.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah, I really see that, and I can really see how that approach does work on all 3 levels of the needs, because they're now feeling more competent. They feel connected to you because you actually help them to see something about themselves that they didn't know. And you're also like giving them inside information. Like I always feel like,
yes.
when especially teenagers, but even all of us, when we start to learn about ourselves and we get it, we're like, whoa, like I'm like on the inner circle of like, who knows this stuff? This is cool stuff,
Yes.
And so there's a sense of, the relatedness, the competence, and then the autonomy is really them starting to say, as you said, they might be like, well, I do sort of understand why it's important, but I'm just not feeling like I can, I can do it. And then as you're scaffolding or whatever, providing, access to more resources, then they can actually take charge.
Yes, exactly. I think I was thinking about this right as you were saying it really works with all 3 needs. And what came to my mind was just that I think a common pitfall that actually many parents and educators and coaches fall into, that sort of undermines the whole motivational process, is focusing so much on the behavior and the outcome. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, if the thing is to just do this particular assignment, it's like, well, come on, they're just talking about doing it. Like, come on, you'll feel so much better after it's done and it's a good grade, and trying to make the rationale. But then the student, so these are all extrinsic motivators. We'll talk more about that in a second, but the student is then trying to push themselves, right, to do the thing. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're talking about here is we're like, by removing barriers, removing those obstacles, and increasing the sort of global motivational capacity, it puts them in a place where they are able to choose to do it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean they automatically will or should or must. It's just that they're actually capable of it. Mm-hmm. And then I think it's so to be fully autonomy supportive, it's like helpful to resist the urge to nudge them in the direction. It's like to trust. And this is, I think, a challenge for a lot of people, is to trust that if I like empower this person to have the capacity, the motivational capacity to choose it, that they most likely will. And really kind of sort of resisting the temptation to step in and kind of intervene or force that choice on them. That's how you meet all three needs. And the beautiful thing about it is that it then even further increases, it meets that third need, and so it further increases their overall motivational capacity, makes it even more possible for them to make that choice confidently, because they're feeling so resourced. I mean, if you think about the one of the two things that keeps people from being motivated in the first place is not feeling like they have the capacity to achieve the goal.
Right.
And so the more resource someone has, the more it's that taking on that challenge is going to seem like an opportunity to demonstrate their competence.
Right.
And so there's a very strong natural motivator, intrinsic motivator, built-in motivator to actually want to take on that challenge and to engage and grapple with it and to like get it done and all for all those reasons that we could articulate. But letting them kind of get to the point where they're feeling so well resourced that they choose it is the ideal.
So I think about a parent.
Yeah.
And I think about you as an educator have a tremendous amount of competence in the area of their academics, right? So you know how to resource, you know how to help, you know how to scaffold, you know how to do all those things. And so a lot of parents, that wouldn't be as available to them to go through, to feel the parent would not be feeling competence in that area. I know that I don't. And so one of my thoughts is that, and I would love to know if you would agree with me on this, that if I were to simplify this and I were to just think about like a parent, that if a parent could do two things. So, I have two things because there are two specific things on my mind. I would say that the first thing they could do is to, before they even talk to their child, spend a few minutes breathing and regulating their own nervous systems and sort of detaching from the outcome piece of it and the behavior piece of it. So doing what they can do to come to the place of making the relationship, even if just for those 10 minutes that you're going to be in their room or whatever it is, or 1 minute, that a regulated nervous system and a relational approach, if that's all that you can do because you don't feel you're capable of, maybe even you don't understand motivation enough to ask the right questions, or you don't feel like you understand the subject enough to help them. But you do know your child and you do have a relationship with your child. And so that's my own gut says, like, if this were me and I were needing to go and I'm going to practice this, I'm excited to practice it. I might forget the specific questions. Those two categories, I might forget them. But what I do know is that before I go in, I can do the best I can to regulate my nervous system as much as possible, which means I breathe, which means I need to detach a little bit from my, the idea that there's a certain outcome, and that I need to prioritize a relationship. All of those things can get me into a good state of mind so that when I do enter and I want to have this conversation with my kiddo, that they don't feel the energy of me sort of like a coercion, or like an energy of me
or
wanting
them,
like, or
what's
judgment.
wrong with you? Why aren't you just doing your damn homework?
Exactly. And so then I come in with the intention of just being curious and understanding and wanting to be the person that sort of, it's like we get fortified by relationships. We get fortified. So like if if you can't teach them certain skills or give them other resources, what we can resource them with is the sense of a full cup.
Yeah.
And feeling the attachment energy and feeling connected and feeling less alone.
Yeah.
And that's why sometimes I think that those statements, like something like, yeah, like, you know what, I actually do remember what it's like when I was in school, or even just last week, I had to write something for work and I was like sitting at my computer kind of paralyzed, and, you know, and I just wanted you to know that it's not, I do get it. I actually have been there. And, you know, for them to feel that sense of that, they get to then at least have a little bit of the cloak of the pressure and the cloak of like any stories they have in their head about like not being good enough, or they're alone and no one else is dealing with except for me. They get to go, oh, sheesh. And it might just free up a little bit of capacity for them to be able to think more clearly, to look at the problem more clearly, to sometimes it's just us being there and they just say, well, they don't even need us to say a thing. They just need to say, I do know I need to do it. I'm kind of annoyed. I really want to go for a mountain bike ride, and, you know, whatever. And they get to just sort of like process it out loud. So that's for me, because I sometimes can get intimidated by having to remember too many things to ask, or too many steps in something. Yes. And so if I just keep reminding us that ultimately it's about, you know, us doing our own work and connecting relationally, if that can be the guiding light for people, that probably actually is going to be a massive step in the right direction for our children.
Agree. So I feel like we're going to run out of time here if we don't sort of dive in to a little bit more theory.
So I have a yes.
Yeah.
And I have, will you be going into intrinsic or into extrinsic?
I think extrinsic. I'll just touch on intrinsic and then extrinsic, because there's not so much to say about intrinsic, because it's sort of like when it's there, it's obvious. And oftentimes it's like, you know, parents are kind of like, sometimes, like at the top of the show, we talked about how it can be an ideal that we're striving for, but we can also see it as like, oh, it's just what the things they want to do: hang out with friends, play video games, go on social media, you know, whatever. And so then intrinsic motivation can also be seen as a negative. And so, but regardless, there's not as much to say about it, because when it's happening, it's just sort of effortless. Mm-hmm. So yeah, and the only thing I would say to it is that once I understood this better, I did actually find myself being more positive about the places where my kids were intrinsically motivated. So like when they were playing video games, like actually appreciating, like, isn't that really cool that you're so intrinsically motivated to do that? And I would actually call it out and say, are there other things that you're intrinsically motivated to do like that? Or wouldn't it be cool if you could find some other things that feel that good, that you just want to do that, you know? Yeah. And kind of, I think it goes back to, again, like feeling when you have the language, when someone has the language around motivation and they understand the difference between when they're intrinsically motivated and they're not, at a minimum, that it's just good information. Yeah. Yeah. I guess I can add one thing about it, which is that in the spirit of what you just said, it's like, you know, if we can get to a point where we are so kind of feeling crushed that we don't feel any intrinsic motivation for anything, and that's definitely not that's starting to be depressed, and that's definitely not a good place to be. And so I think it's important that we do honor intrinsic motivation and say, hey, that's like life force moving through us. I think there's an important distinction between intrinsic motivation and, say, like addiction. Yes. Those are not the same things. Intrinsic motivation is highly autonomous. This is the distinction. Highly autonomous. It's like, I'm choosing to do it. I'm not feeling compelled or, you know, even inwardly compelled to do it. An addiction is, you know, you can fight it and still end up doing it. And that's not autonomous. And this maybe is a good segue into the gradations of external or extrinsic motivation, because because there's different forms of it where we're either more or less aligned with that extrinsic motivation. And when we're more aligned with it, it's a lot more positive. And when we're less aligned with it, it's more negative and has more negative side effects.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'm having this this thought. And the thought is this. The thought is that we stop now and we call this laziness. And then we do, next week, we go into extrinsic motivation in a whole episode.
There's enough there.
I think there's enough there. And I think that I think that actually in some ways intrinsic motivation and this idea of amotivation or laziness are kind of linked, because there's sort of two ends of the spectrum, and they are, there's this way that I also think that we can have like amotivation in some areas of our life and then intrinsic motivation in other areas of our life. So, you might be amotivated as it relates to your academics, and you might be highly motivated when it comes to being with your friends, intrinsically motivated when you're with your friends and when you're playing video games, for example. And I also can imagine that if a person were on the far end of a motivation, like you said, someone who's like very depressed and they're not doing anything, if they're just intrinsically motivated to eat, that's actually awesome on that day. You know what I mean? Like, so we can see that like there's this way that by where intrinsic motivation can be so protective for people, because it's like if you're feeling motivation in all areas of your life, but you feel highly motivated intrinsically on that day to get up, walk outside and sit in the sun, that might be the beginning of you starting to feel some more hope in your life, and to not feel so extreme on the other end. So there's this way that those two polarities kind of can go together, and then there's that whole like gray in the middle that we want to talk about extrinsic motivation, and it seems like it would be worthy of a longer discussion.
So this 2-part series has turned into a 4-part series.
That's what happens.
I mean, this is such rich stuff.
It's so important. And actually, had I thought about this even more, I probably would have thought this was a good idea to talk about this as in the context of laziness, because I think that people really want to understand laziness.
Yes. Yeah.
What we call laziness.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, in that case, we will save talking about extrinsic motivation for next week.
Yeah.
And what I will say about it by way of a teaser is that punishments and rewards are the most common forms of it. And the problem is not that punishments and rewards don't work. The problem is that they do work. And so we're tempted to use them, but we don't without this framework, it's very hard to understand why they end up having some really counterproductive side effects over the long term. Really problematic. Really, so problematic. Oh God, this is. Please, I beg of you, tune in next week. Just to understand this one thing, why that's so problematic. And then if you once you understand how problematic it is, if you still want to use it, at least you're doing so from an informed position. Yeah. And you can choose that and see, and then when the negative repercussions come, you'll be more able to connect them. So you go, okay, yeah, was that worth it? But if you don't have the framework, it's very hard to connect the initial motivational strategy with the negative reaction or outcome or side effect. And so then it's hard to then course correct. So that's my teaser. All right. Well, that's a good teaser. Okay. I think that's great. Okay. So next time, extrinsic motivation, talking about rewards, punishments. It's a really great topic. And so we'll wrap it up now. Yeah. And for anyone who hasn't already, please do subscribe. I think that it is the best way to get our every episode
as it drops.
Definitely.
And please also feel free to rate and review and to share with anyone else who might get some value out of these conversations.
Yes.
Okay, and that's it for today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.